So ultimately, I feel like Tre Harris isn't really getting the recognition that he should be getting, and there isn't enough excitement around him based on his production profile alone. This is one of the best production profiles I've ever worked on, and I've been doing this for like the past 5 or 4 years now. He's maybe like a top 3 profile as far as being a productive wide receiver in the SEC. I know people have him as their top 5 or up to top 10 consistent wide receiver. People have him as a projected day 2 pick, and this guy should absolutely be a day 1 wide receiver based on his production profile alone. If we're talking about creating these profiles, there's always one that has the highest correlations towards NFL success and dynasty wide receiver success, and that's yards per route run. We all know it, right? So Tre Harris had a career yards per route run of 3 yards per route run, which is elite. For example, Malik Neighbors was at 2.83 and Puka Nacua was at 3.45. Anything up towards 3 is really good. These are all elite prospects. If we're talking about their single best season, Tre Harris' single best season in yards per route run was last year in 24. It was 5.12. That's insane. That is so high. Malik Neighbors was at 3.64. and Puka Nacua is at 3.53. And there's also one other stat that I like to heavily rely on. This is, first downs per route run. How heavily was this guy leaned on as a chain mover? How much did that offense depend on him, essentially, right? So for career first downs per route run, Tre Harris was at 0.3 rate first downs per route run, right? Malik Neighbors was at 12.9, and Puka Nacua was at 13.4. You want that anything above that 10 threshold, 10 benchmark is where you want to see your guys as far as career first downs per route run. In their best seasons, Puka Nacua was at 16.3, Malik Neighbors was at 16.2, and Tre Harris last year was at 18.4. Tre Harris was going to do something very special last year. So we need to start talking about Tre Harris as a first round prospect who's going to be a huge addition for an NFL team and is going to be a huge addition for your dynasty teams, right? And what I like about these production profiles is that they do 3 things that I really like, right? They serve 3 purposes. 1, they provide a picture about who the wide receiver is in general. 2, they help me understand the probability of how much success this wide receiver, how likely they are to be successful in the NFL and as a dynasty asset. And 3, most importantly, I think when I'm done creating all the production profiles, the stats lead me to the film, and this is where I'm getting to my next point about Tre Harris. When I looked at his stats, I said, okay, I need to understand this guy's route diversity because these numbers are insane. I want to see what he did that was so great. So earlier this offseason, I charted every single route that Tre Harris was targeted on in the 24 season. And what I found was that he wasn't used as an intermediate option and a deep option very much. It was very low, actually. And you'd expect the guy who's 6'2", 202 pounds to be a huge asset in those intermediate deep parts of the field. On the contrary, the route that he was targeted on the most were hitch routes, which is where you run 4 to 5 yards past the line of scrimmage, turn around and catch the ball and try to create extra yards. He was targeted on those routes 32% of the time. The second highest route he was targeted on was a screen. That was a pass behind the line of scrimmage, and that was at a 14% rate. And he was targeted next behind the line of scrimmage or just beyond the line of scrimmage 46% of the time. That is nearly half of his routes, right? So I started to try to figure out what was going on. Was it because Tre Harris wasn't good, or was it because Jackson Dart wasn't good and they were trying to keep Tre Harris close to the line to conceal Jackson Dart's weaknesses? Well, after watching all Tre Harris's film, I understood that, in the brief glimpses that I did see him in the intermediate and the deep, that he is actually a very dominant wide receiver. So I started to look at Jackson Dart's numbers, and I went to PFF, and it showed that Jackson Dart actually had the most deep pass attempts among all FBS quarterbacks at 88. He had an adjusted completion percentage of 47.7%. I had a QB rating of 109.4%. That's very good. So Jackson Dart really wasn't a horrible deep passer. And the only reason I asked that was because when I charted Tre Harris, the route that he was targeted on the third most was actually a post route, right? And he ran 30 post routes, was targeted 9 times on post routes, and caught 6 of those 9 passes. One was an incompletion because of a drop pass by Tre Harris, and another one was underthrown ball. Tre Harris was absolutely dominant on post routes. 8 of the 9 targets he got on post routes were against man coverage. He beat double coverage numerous times. Absolutely dominant. The other deep routes that Tre Harris received were go routes, boundary routes, right? And again, ran 30, was targeted 9 times, just like the post route, and only had 3 completions though, because there was a huge disconnect between Jackson Dart and Tre Harris. Jackson Dart underthrew and overthrew Tre Harris constantly on go routes. What else could I think of? What else was happening? Okay, so what is the essence of a hitch route and a screen route? They're extensions of the run game. Those 2 routes are extensions of the run game, right? So I said, okay, let's look at Ole Miss's running backs. Henry Parrish Jr. and Ulysses Bentley were the 2 starting running backs, right? Those 2 running backs combined for 1,278 scrimmage yards, not rushing yards, scrimmage yards between 2 backs. That is something a prominent RB1 for a team can surpass by himself alone, match or surpass at least. So that tells me that Lane Kiffin didn't want to rely on those running backs in the run game. He said, let's give it to Tre Harris, the big guy who could box out defenders and get yards after the catch. And so I started looking at how effective he was on the yards after the catch for each of those 2 routes, the screen pass and the hitch route. On the hitch route, he averaged 9 yards per reception. Very effective. On the screen pass, 6 yards per reception. Very effective. Better than a run game. So that cleared that up for me. So in 24, he was targeted only 18.4% in the intermediate, which is low. If we're looking at 2023, the target percentage was at 29.9%, and that is because they had Quinshon Judkins on the team, who surpassed the scrimmage yards of the 24 running backs. Judkins had 1,307 scrimmage yards, right? And that freed up Tre Harris to come out from behind the line of scrimmage, where he was only targeted at 3.4% as opposed to the 13% he was targeted in 24, right? He was only targeted in the short game 41% of the time as opposed to 49% of the time in 24, right? So deep percentages went up 4%. Tre Harris as a deep target guy, we need to talk about him as an intermediate and deep target guy, right? So Harris had a 21% deep target rate, 24, which is on the low side. You want to see something closer to 25%, right? It's not terrible, but Neighbors had 23% during his final year in college. Marvin Harrison Jr. had 21%. Brian Thomas was at 25%. So 21%, 25%, not bad. So during the weeks that Tre Harris was active, which was weeks 1 through 7, and then week 13 was his final week he played. So during those weeks, he was tied 6th in deep targets and led all wide receivers with at least 16 deep targets in yards per route run. He led all of them in yards per route run, right? He also led the NFL in passer rating when targeted deep with a NFL passer rating of 140. Harris also led all wide receivers in yards per route run versus man coverage, right? So he was dominant. The post route was the route he was targeted on 3rd most in 24 after the hitch and screen routes. He was targeted on 9 post routes, caught 6 of 9 targets. He beat double coverage on 2 incompletions, and he was overthrown once and dropped the other. 8 of his 9 post routes were against double coverage. This guy is a baller. He needs to be talked about more.